On today's World Insight, heat waves hit vast swaths of the Northern Hemisphere, from Western Europe to Central Asia and North America, with record high temperatures rising beyond 40 degrees Celsius. The new normal? How can hundreds of millions of people adapt? And what does it mean for climate action? Here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello, I'm Tian Wei, and this is World Insight. Blistering heat waves are baking the world as high temperatures scorch parts of Europe, the US, and Asia, burning wildfires, melting runways, warped roads, and overheated hospitals. This is a reality in recent weeks. Britain has issued its first ever red warning for extreme heat as temperatures in parts of England topped 40 degrees Celsius. Spain and Portugal reported hundreds of heat-related deaths. The fierce heat wave has also sparked wildfires in Europe that have forced tens of thousands to flee to safety. In the United States, weather alerts are up in 28 states from California to New Hampshire, affecting hundreds of millions of people. Central Asia is buckling under high temperatures too. India has experienced 40+ degrees Celsius heat in April alone. Meanwhile, China has entered Sanfu, the 3 10-day periods that tend to be the hottest of the year. But forecasters have already issued high temperature warnings on days of the last month, which will exceed 40 degrees Celsius. The heat wave hit as UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres warns half of humanity is in a danger zone of the climate crisis. Some warn these heat waves are a sign of more extreme weather to come. For more on the heat waves and what's behind it, for example, climate change, we are joined in London, Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue. In New York, Stephen Cohen, professor at the Earth Institute of Columbia University. Meanwhile, in Seattle, John Zadrotnik, who is an atmospheric scientist from Washington State University. In Washington, D.C., Wu Changhua, originally from China, she is the China Director of the Office of Jeremy Rifkin. Welcome to every one of you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad to be joined in this hot summer by all of you because you probably could give us some answers. Now, Isabel, what are we experiencing? Is this likely to be the pattern for the future?
Well, according to the head of the UK Meteorological Office, yes, that we could expect temperatures such as we've had this week to occur every 3 years. And remember that as long as records began, and in Britain that goes back several hundred years, we have never had temperatures as high as we had the day before yesterday. And the difficulty that I think everybody faces is understanding that these temperatures have been produced by carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so there's no sort of stepping back unless we remove the carbon. So it will only get worse from here.
Mr. Zadrotnik, of course, as an atmospheric scientist, you could explain to us what's really happening in the bigger world in a way.
Yes, it appears that climate change is feeding back onto the weather patterns that we see every summer. So we're seeing more what are called blocking ridges of high pressure, and they're getting stronger and more persistent than they were before. So what used to be a heat wave that we could handle is continuing to reach more thresholds of higher and higher temperatures. And we're going to continue to see that as more and more carbon gets put in the atmosphere. So I completely agree that our summer heat waves are just going to continue to get worse as time goes on.
And there are consequences, of course, projected consequences of rising temperatures. To give you some example, the Earth's surface temperature has risen by around 1.1 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. Projections show that an average annual 1 degree Celsius increase could widen burned, wounded areas, per year by as much as 600% in some types of forests. You see the wildfire over there. Due to high temperature, the burned forest area increased threefold this year already in France alone compared with 2021. While in Portugal, over 30,000 hectares of land have already been destroyed by fire this year. And this is only one of those examples how high temperature is leading to wildfire and the natural disasters. Now, Professor Cohen, adaptation, what are we doing?
Well, what we're starting to do, but much too slowly, is to decarbonize our economies. And I think that's really the answer to this. We need to get off of fossil fuels. That won't adapt to climate change. That will help to mitigate climate change. For adaptation, we're seeing many coastal communities preparing for floods. We're seeing more response to intense weather events, more expectation that this is the future. But I think the long-term answer is we need to decarbonize our economy.
Of course, that is the long-term future, but about adaptation, Ms. Wu, that is very crucial because we cannot just talk about an aspiration without looking at the realities. Are we capable in terms of adaptations? Do technology provide us the opportunity? Do policies provide us the opportunity? Do actions really lead us to the opportunity?
Well, adaptation and resilience are becoming the theme of the day.
The problem is that we've invested...
Let's have Ms. Wu first. I'll come back to you, Professor Cohen. Thank you.
Yeah. Resilience definitely has become a major theme of the day. The popular saying is that mitigation and adaptation literally have to go hand in hand. There definitely been major progresses made in terms of adaptation. If you look at the satellite technology, early warning, forecasting, research, meteorological forecasting, they are definitely playing their role so that we'll be able to reduce or prevent as much losses or damages as possible. In the meantime, I think particularly from China perspective, the government has been stepping up efforts. And just last month, mid of June, the government released something called China's Climate Adaptation Resilience Strategy 2035. That's literally the first national comprehensive integrated strategy to really pull the country together to become a more climate resilient society. So steps are starting to be elevated to the level, hopefully will be matching up with the challenges we're facing today.
Of course, we're talking about the adaptation, which is the very first step. Professor Cohen, you want to add something here?
Well, what I was going to say is that we've invested trillions of dollars in the infrastructure of the human settlements around the planet based on an existing weather system. So there are limits to what we can afford to do in terms of adaptation. We are, in this city after Hurricane Sandy, we spent billions of dollars to make the city more climate resistant, and we've done that. But there are limits to how far that's going to be able to help us. We really do have to move off of fossil fuels, and that's not aspirational. This is something that's within reach. We just have to decide to modernize our energy economy, and if we do it, we can actually lower the cost of energy, because instead of digging fossil fuels out of the ground and transporting it and then burning it, we use more and more advanced technology to simply turn the sun into the energy that we need. And this is starting. This process is well underway. We need governments to accelerate the process if we're going to be able to mitigate climate change.
Isabel, even if governments speeded up this process, will that be able to catch up with the speed of global warming and the climate change? You know, if we look at this, one of the UK's most disastrous heat waves hit some 46 years ago, as we know, in 1976. It's a prolonged event that set many records. While this heat wave has not matched that of 1976 heat wave for the longevity, it is projected to be even more intense. So if you look at this map, you know, comparing 1976 to 2022, we see the dramatic changes. Are we really going to catch up with the speed of climate change, even though actions could be taken right now?
Well, indeed, actions are being taken, but as we've heard, they're way too slow, and we're not going to catch up because already climate change is accelerating, and that is it means that it's very difficult to catch. I'd like to say something though on adaptation, if I may, because one of the lessons and one of the differences between the 1976 heat wave and today is the damage to infrastructure. I mean, as we know, engineering stress tests relate to the previous 100 years. So everything in Britain has been built to withstand stresses that were in existence for the 100 years before the infrastructure was built. Now we have a completely new set of stresses. So among the things that happened here when the heat became very intense was that the railway lines started melting and the overhead cables started to sag. So transport was disrupted. Everything from the tar on the roads to the lack of air conditioning in the houses. And looking longer term, we are looking at sea level rise, because these hot temperatures are going to accelerate sea level rise. And all of our delta cities, London is essentially a delta city, as is Shanghai and Guangzhou. Those are very hard to defend against the kind of sea level rise that we're going to see. And we're only at 1.1 degree of warming. 1.5 was meant to be the relatively safe and achievable target. We are not on target for that. But this is a taste of what will happen as we move towards 1.5. If we go beyond that, we are in completely terrifying territory, actually. It really is unknown. And there will be parts of the world, like Africa, which become, or parts of Central Africa, or indeed Saudi Arabia, where temperatures are just too high for human beings.
You know, what you said, Isabel, earlier, people thought, oh, those are the threats coming from, the climate change scientists. They have their own interests inside this, so they want to warn us with something, that would be dramatic. But actually, we are seeing it right now. It's not only in northern America or in Europe, but also in Central Asia, even China recently. Take a closer look at the blistering picture and also temperature in China. A record high 42 degrees Celsius was recorded in Zhejiang province this year. For example, east of Shanghai last week, dozens of China's weather stations recorded temperatures topped historical highs, among which the daily highest temperature in some counties of Hebei and Yunnan provinces reached about 44 degrees Celsius. Come on, these are provinces coming from northern part of China, coming from southern part of China, very different parts of China, and yet they're all hitting their record high to a certain extent. China's National Meteorological Center forecasts that by July 26, high temperatures above 35 degrees Celsius would hit southern parts of China in a large degree. These numbers are with us. Ms. Wu, you have been working on the climate change issue with many Chinese scientists. Now tell me more about how aware is this issue in one of the largest emerging countries in the world?
Well, it's hard to describe that quantitatively, but I believe last couple of years in particular, if you look at flooding, last year's flooding in Henan province, and if you look at heat waves this year, I think the reality is literally educating the public, the whole society, everyone actually in the country. See, climate change is already here. We are living in it. We need to figure out what to do, what actions to take. In particular for China at this moment, the clean energy transition becomes so critical, not only for the sake of the country itself, but also for humanity. In the meantime, adaptation has to be put on the very high level, at least probably at the same level as mitigation as well. That's why I mentioned the National Strategy 2035 is already rolled out there. So now it requires the whole society, government, business, the whole society, every individual needs to be part of the climate resilience adaptivity as well.
Well, we know that earlier for developing countries, emerging economies, there were internal debates about what to do with what kind of speed, whose responsibility is it? Of course, it is shared responsibility, but of course, industrial nations have been putting out emissions throughout history. So there's a lot of debates. But now, one of the biggest developing emerging economies like China has already been committing to 2030, 2060 targets. But having said that, though, now it becomes more complicated for the developed economies, particularly for Europe, Isabel, with some of the energy crisis related to geopolitics and also to the transition that we are experiencing right now. Germany, for example, has to go back to some of the coal power plants that already run out of its state. So how do you see this struggling that some of the developed economies are having right now? Is there likely to be achieving the goal on time?
You're absolutely right that geopolitics are complicating this, but I think in European terms, the European Union has had a very, very robust transition strategy in place. And in fact, Russia's actions in Ukraine and the threats of the loss of Russian energy to a big economy like Germany have occasioned some short-term adjustments, such as extending the life of some coal-fired power plants. But that will sort of see us through next winter, if you like. But the warning about the geopolitics has been taken to suggest that we need to move far more rapidly to renewables. That is where energy security really lies, and not in the importing of carbon-heavy fuels from unstable parts of the world. And I think that lesson has been driven home very, very soundly. The problem, though, is that in a short-term crisis, countries lack money and they're politically distracted. And one thing you do need for radical mitigation policy is a certain amount of money and political will. And so these short-term crises, they do damage climate action because they fill the agenda, and it's quite hard for politicians to keep focus on the climate.
It is not just the geopolitics, but also internal politics, it seems, Mr. Zach Rocknick. For example, the U.S., the climate change legislation has failed so far under this administration, and many see a big delay of the actions and missing the target. So what do you make of these kinds of internal political drag of the target that needs to be achieved?
I think it's very disappointing and very concerning from a scientist's perspective, because we know that every year that we don't take action brings us closer to some of the dangerous targets that have been talked about, such as 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. And it also means that when we do eventually realize that we have to do this, we'll have to do it more dramatically and more drastically. And we're in the year 2022 now, so we're already getting quite close to some of the goals that have been set for 2030 or 2040. And if you just look at how quickly we're going one direction on the curve in terms of emissions are still increasing in many cases. So we haven't even managed to stabilize our emissions, much less reduce, or even more so, not even reduce at a drastic rate. So it just feels like time is running out, and this administration has yet to produce any concrete policy in order to reverse that.
Professor Cohen, politics is a reality of life, isn't it?
That's
we have realized that much more these days. Your take on that?
Well, first of all, it's not true that the administration has done nothing. $300 billion in the infrastructure bill were directed toward environmental issues, including $20 billion toward grid modernization. The federal government itself, which purchases $600 billion a year of all sorts of things, is moving in a green direction. And state and local governments, including New York and California, are rapidly decarbonizing their energy systems. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding, particularly among climate scientists, about how American politics works. So that's one part. The second piece, which I think is also important, is that this is a complicated transition. Energy is central to economic life, and it's not going to happen overnight. But in fact, if you look at state and local governments and you look at corporations, we are in the beginning stages of the process of decarbonizing our economy. It's not going to happen quickly. It's a generation-long change. And it's true, we're going to have more greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and I think at some point we're going to be looking at geoengineering to pull some of that carbon out of the atmosphere with carbon capture and storage. I mean, that's the unfortunate. Our political regimes and our economic stability requires energy, and this transition is complicated and it's going to take a while to achieve, and I think people need to understand that.
Ms. Wu, I hear that argument very interestingly because it used to be the developing and the emerging economies, for example, at international forums trying to argue that way. And now we see the global north, if I could use that general term, which is sometimes not necessarily accurate, but very interestingly arguing that way. Having said that, though, I want to ask you and push you more on what China can do and what has been done. Ms. Wu, the 2030-2060 agenda and target, very clear, all set out over there with every number already put out. And there's a blueprint every step of the way. So how do you see, now with the slowing down of the economies worldwide, with the challenges of the pandemic, and also with high temperatures like this, that's certainly going to have an impact on all of us, how is China working on its blueprint?
Well, as we're discussing here, it's very complicated. I totally agree with Professor Cohen. It's not simply about renewable energy or about electric vehicles. It's part of how we transform our economy, our infrastructure, of course, including our energy system there as well. On one side, we need to address the physical part, but also on the other side, we need to address the people issue, inequality, poverty, among others there as well. China definitely has its own plan. And the plan is basically, setting a timeline that should be delivered. And at this moment, and I think we all agree, if we put China's commitment into the Paris Agreement, that's pretty much aligned. But if you put China's action into the global climate like heat waves, it's far inadequate at this moment. That's why more than ever, China needs to step up its efforts to really accelerate the clean energy transition, not only domestically, but also working with other countries, both the North and the South, because China has developed a very strong value chain, supply chain in terms of clean energy technologies there. I think the northern parts of the world need to put aside the geopolitics and really take advantage of China's strengths and expertise, figure out how to work together to accelerate the global clean energy transition.
I'm glad you brought up the topic of technologies, because we know some of the technology is already existing and we can take advantage of that. Of course, everybody should come together rather than being divided in terms of technologies because we have limited time. On the other hand, there are technologies that have not been invented. It needs to be a lot more cooperation, concerted efforts, investment, continued efforts together. So how do we see these very complex picture of technologies and applications of technologies? Isabel?
Well, I think technology was often invoked as the kind of magic bullet. So people who didn't want mitigation action would say, well, we'll get to a certain point and technology will fix it. I think that techno-optimism is quite dangerous. We need everything at this point. It's not an either or, it's an and. The technology of removing carbon from the atmosphere, for example, it's kind of there, but it's windingly expensive. Everything we do, to rectify, be it adaptation, be it things like carbon removal, are far more expensive than mitigation, than the energy transition, for example, which, as we know, is not cheap. But it's really important to keep in mind that, yes, we're very good at technology, we human beings, but to get those technologies to a point where they can be effective, excuse me, in a global crisis like this, that's going to take time.
Yeah. Let me go to Professor Cohen on that as well. We are seeing multiple crises happening all at the same time. Climate change is only one of those. There's the energy crisis, we also mentioned, food crisis, geopolitical crisis. It really takes a lot of efforts to work out this maze in a way that we had never experienced before, when they are being one piled up after another together. So Professor Cohen, at this point, what do you see are the key here?
Well, first of all, I think we need to understand that despite these challenges, people on our planet are actually living overall better and higher quality of lives today than at any time in human history. So I think a little bit of perspective is in order here. But in terms of the technology, I think what's really important to understand is that the energy system we have now is old, and it's inefficient, and it's expensive. And so investment in redoing that energy system and modernizing the energy system in the developed world, and making sure that the developing world skips over the coal-fired power plant stage is really what we need to do. We need to focus in a very positive way on a lower cost, more reliable, less polluting energy system. That is, I think, a goal that cuts across every country, except for, of course, the ones that are making lots of money off of fossil fuels. But all the other countries in the world know that we need that. The only form of real energy security is going to be through renewable energy. And so those technologies do need to be invested in and developed. And all I can say is that in my lifetime, I've seen incredible improvements in the technological base of our economy. And I think we're going to see more of that here, because there's no single issue that's more important than this energy transformation.
I really want to ask about this question, because last year's climate change conference, even though it is quite a smooth one, but we haven't seen it be able to produce much beyond what we already know. So with a more complicated environment we know these days, Mr. Zachralnik, how do you see we are preparing for the COP conferences later this year? And do you see what you have all been calling on together, so-called international cooperation, likely to happen at this point?
I sure hope so. I think in my view, the atmosphere doesn't care about geopolitics. It only cares about how much carbon is put into it. And I understand that this is a slow process and that we have to work through international cooperation. And that yes, we are living a high quality of life right now, but then now is the time to be drastic, because what happens when we hit 2C, when we hit 2.5C, if we are as slow as Professor Cohen is saying that we're going to be in transitioning the energy economy, we're going to be dealing with a whole bunch of other crises caused by climate change. This is what happens when it's 45C instead of 40C, so it really terrifies me, honestly, that we're kind of talking about just the realities of how slow this is going to be. Yeah. So I think that we need to start treating this as a crisis, not as and I do not share the optimism that we're moving anywhere near as fast as we need to.
Okay. Joe Zachralnik, Isabel Hilton, Stephen Cohen, Wu Changhua. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us on this edition of World Insight. Really appreciate it. With that, we're coming to the end of our program today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. Check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us. Bye for now, and keep cool during the summer.